Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to the second day of the conference. If you're like me, I took a lot of notes yesterday, began to reflect on these future conflicts and what really are some of the implications. And you need to be assured that today you will not have an intellectual rest, as we have a lot of fascinating panels and then a lunchtime keynote presentation by Dr. P.W. Singer, strategist at New America and the author of Ghost Fleet. Before I turn this to Ed Barrett, I want to do something that normally we do at the end of the conference, but a lot of times people are worn out by that time and ready to go, and that is I want to thank members of the Stockdale staff who make this all possible, because I just get up here to the podium and do things, but there's actually all the work that goes behind the scenes. Our deputy director is Major Daniel Goff, who's in his tactical uniform today because he's got to do something tactical with midshipmen out on Hospital Point here in a moment. Our director of research is Ed Barrett, who most of you know. The director of influencer development, Admiral Blues Baker, who's right there. One of our associate directors, Sean Baker, who's at the computer over here, who in real time updates our Facebook page with what's going on here at the conference, which is amazing in itself. He's tried to convince me to have a Twitter account, but I have not done that yet because I don't want to compete with the president, so we'll leave that at that. The senior staff associate and event planner, Marge Bem, who's there at the table as well. Jacqueline Dana, who's out in the hallway, who does all the administrative pieces as you enter in. The distinguished chair of leadership, General Sattler, who's not here yet but will be joining us. He's the one who introduced our lunchtime speaker yesterday. All we have to do in the Stockdale Center is feed him Mountain Dews, and he keeps going. Our distinguished chair in ethics, David Luban, who's right here in one of the front tables. The resident fellows this year, you'll see each of them at some point during the day today. Dr. David Lefkowitz, Dr. Adam Betts, and Dr. Andrew Bell. And finally, Ms. Kathy Kindig, who's our IT wizard, who supports Loose Hall where we work. She's also at the table. So I'd like to give them all a round of applause for what they do. And I'm now going to turn it over to Ed, who will moderate the first panel on soft war. Can I just make one other comment before you come up? The other thing I was just going to mention is when you're asking, a couple of people have asked me about this, when you're asking questions of the panelists or speakers, if you could project your voice so that you can actually get the question heard by not just the panelists but the whole audience, that would be greatly appreciated. Normally the questions are complex enough that it's hard for the speaker to try to repeat the question. So again, if you would just be considerate of those at the other side of the room when you're asking one of those questions. Sorry, Ed. Sure. There we go.
Okay, day two. The method to this madness resembles that we used in the seminar this year. The first semester we read all these futures from government agencies, academia, think tanks, just to try to pull out the issues that we're going to face in the future. And then in the second semester, having pulled out the key ones, we delved into the philosophical, ethical literature on these topics. So that's what we're going to do today, delve into select issues that we saw in these futures that we're going to be grappling with for years. So, and one of the big ones was the use of non-lethal means that are normally associated with last resort measures, but now it seems like states and non-states are using them constantly. And then the question comes up, are they justified? And then what responses to them are justified? So we have a panel focusing on that issue here. And it's led by Dr. Michael Gross, who's professor and head of the School of Political Science at the University of Haifa, Israel. He has just co-edited a volume that's coming out soon? May, okay, on soft war. It's called Soft War. And then what's after the colon?
The ethics of unarmed conflict.
Unarmed conflict, okay. So, and Michael has, as they say, a good nose. He's always ahead of the game, anticipating what's coming that's going to be important, and he's done it again. This is an excellent volume. And then contributing pieces to that volume are Dr. Jessica Wolfendale, Associate Professor of Philosophy at West Virginia University and a former fellow here, thank you. And then Dr. Valerie Morkevicius, Associate Professor, just got tenure at Political Science at Colgate University, also a former fellow. So thank you all for coming, and Michael is going to give a short introduction.
Right, thanks. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank Ed and the Center for inviting us and giving us an opportunity to talk about our new book. This is a book called Soft War, as Ed said, The Ethics of Unarmed Conflict. And very briefly, I'm going to just give a brief overview of some of the topics, and then I'm going to introduce my colleagues, and I'll come back and say a few words at the end. We were concerned in this book to deal with a variety of issues. Ed called them non-lethal warfare. At first, we preferred to call them non-kinetic warfare. And these were issues like cyber terrorism, cyber warfare, cyber terrorism, public diplomacy, propaganda, nonviolent resistance, and a few others. And the idea was that these kinds of warfare, or these kinds of tactics, were becoming more and more prominent. And when my co-editor and I, Tamar Meisels from Tel Aviv University, began to work on this, we contacted a number of people, and we asked them to try to think outside their comfort zone a little bit and give us some input and some of their expertise with regard to the law and ethics of war and how it might apply to unarmed conflict. After all, we speak of the law of armed conflict, but we really have no law of unarmed conflict. So this is the volume that Ed mentioned. It'll be out in May, and we should have some more information about that then. Again, the topics that we discuss here are some of the topics coming off of this fine quote from the Department of the Army that some of the best weapons of both insurgents and counterinsurgents don't shoot are issues like cyber warfare, media warfare, public diplomacy, nonviolent resistance, economic warfare, sanctions, blockades, and lawfare. So we're going to be talking about a few of those today. Just one word before my colleagues take over, and that is we conceive of soft war as different from both jus ad vim and different from soft power. Jus ad vim, the term that Michael Walzer coined a few years ago, refers to the use of force short of war. And many of these tactics are, in fact, kinetic. Targeted killing, Tomahawk missiles, assuming there's not too many of them, and other sorts of tactics that involve no-fly zones, that involve the use of force, of kinetic force, but just short of war. Whereas the kind of tactics that we discuss here might come instead of war, but they also might supplement war. So we might see them in some of the examples I'll bring later on, in fact, occur during armed conflict. And sometimes, and in contrast to soft power is generally conceived, as it was developed by Joseph Nye, as persuasive means. So yesterday we saw educational efforts in Africa. We saw a baseball team in South America. That's soft power. It's certainly non-kinetic, but it's soft power in the sense that it's persuasive rather than coercive. All the things we talk about, including propaganda and public diplomacy, are largely coercive. So in that sense, the whole discussion of unarmed force differs, we think, significantly and in interesting ways from both jus ad vim and from soft power. Mm-hmm. So the way we're going to do this is Jessica's going to address the question, is soft war really war? Valerie's going to follow with questions about non-combatant immunity in the place of civilians in soft war, and then I want to follow up with two questions. Are these methods effective, and how might states and other actors respond to the use of soft war and unarmed force?
Waiting for the PowerPoint slides to pop up. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Okay, again, I'd like to thank Ed and the Centre for inviting me to speak at this conference. What I'm going to talk about today is a section of my chapter in the Soft War book where I talk about defining war, and I offer and defend a particular definition of war, which then could be applied, I think, to some kinds of soft war conflicts. So what I'm going to do today, due to time constraints, is focus primarily on defending and my definition of war. So I want to talk a little bit about why it matters that we come up with a definition of war for the purposes of looking at unarmed conflict and other kinds of conflict. Then I'm going to talk about what my definition is and how I think I can defend it. I don't think I'll have time to talk about the third section, applying it to some different cases of soft war. So in the chapter I do talk about whether my definition could apply to lawfare or cyber warfare or economic sanctions. But that's something I can talk about in question time if people are interested. Okay, so why does it matter? Why does defining war matter? Well, it matters because war has a very unique legal status and a unique normative status as well. So when an armed conflict is declared according to international law, there's a whole host of legal frameworks that apply, including things which I won't talk about, such as laws governing refugees, laws governing treaty obligations, asylum laws. What I'm going to focus on most, because I think this is where a lot of people do think it matters greatly what conflicts we classify as a war, when a war is declared, both sides have a sort of particular set of belligerent rights. In particular, both sides have the right to fight back against the other side. And legally, that's true regardless of the justness of their respective causes. So belligerents in an armed conflict have the right to kill enemy forces. They have the right to detain prisoners of war without trial, at least until the end of the conflict, of course. And they have the right to expose civilians to some risk of harm. Obviously, that's constrained by principles of proportionality and necessity. And of course, the enemy can fight back. Now, there are constraints that come along with belligerent status as well. It's impermissible to torture enemy soldiers, for example, and typically enemy soldiers who are POWs have to be released. They can't be punished just for fighting in the war. Of course, they can be punished for the commission of war crimes, but they can't be legally tried and punished just because they fought in a war. So clearly it matters greatly which conflicts we want to define as war because this legal framework will apply. And so one of the implications of my view, which is perhaps one of the more controversial implications, is that it might be possible, at least in my view, that who counts as a belligerent might be extended beyond traditional conceptions of military forces. So, why does war have this unique status? Well, we might think a lot of the laws of war reflect some of the thinking in just war theory about justice of war. But there's a gap between the laws of war and our thinking about just war theory. The laws of war do not match onto, and they're not really intended to match onto, our judgments about the justness of respective causes. Partly because it would be impossible for the law to adjudicate, in many cases, between conflicting belligerents about whose cause is just, who's an unjust combatant, who's a just combatant. So the law doesn't distinguish between them. One argument in favour of the belligerent rights and freedoms that come along with combatant status is that perhaps this is necessary to enable wars to be resolved, or at least resolved more quickly than would be possible were, for example, a law enforcement model applied. Law enforcement operations require time, they're much more restricted in the kind of force they can use, and so we might think, well, wars represent a kind of unique breakdown of authority, a situation where there's no governing authority, no adjudicating power who can actually take control and end the conflict. So this sort of unique set of belligerent freedoms, I think at least, has a kind of very practical goal, which is to allow wars to be ended eventually, right? In a situation when there's a breakdown of control and authority, whether that's a breakdown of control between two states or breakdown of control within a state, as in the case of a civil war or an insurgency in some cases. So I just want to talk a little bit briefly about what kinds of definitions of war are out there. And there's not actually that many discussions about the definition of war, at least not in philosophy. A lot of philosophy focuses on what I'm calling just war definitions. So these are definitions that aim to define and describe the conditions that must be met in order for waging war to be justified or morally permissible. And so, of course, the just war tradition is very concerned with this, identifying the conditions that must be met for a war to be just. And this is, associated with thinkers like Augustine and Aquinas and contemporary thinkers like Michael Walzer. I'm not offering a just war definition, to be very clear. My definition is not going to be focused on whether and under what conditions war can be just. The second set of definitions I'm roughly calling juridical definitions. So these are definitions that are intended to identify conflict in order to know when a particular legal framework applies. And Hugo Grotius is actually an early thinker who developed a definition of this sort. In the developing body of international law at that time, he defined war as a state of contending parties as such. And Grotius actually says in The Rights of War and Peace that we have to separate defining war from debates about the justness of war. We can talk sensibly about identifying what war is before we can have a debate about whether or not particular conflicts count as just or unjust. A contemporary legal definition that I came across is one that was proposed by the International Law Association in 2010 at The Hague. And they defined armed conflict as occurring, this is a quote, when there is the existence of organised armed groups who are engaged in fighting in some intensity. So again, a pretty simple definition. There's no reference there to justness of the cause or any of the criterion of just war theory. It's intended to say, here's a conflict that meets a certain kind of threshold beyond which the laws of international armed conflict could apply. So that's organised armed groups and intense fighting. The final category I call political and sociological definitions. So political definitions are characterised by defining war in terms of the aims of the belligerents involved, whether it's the aims are to achieve sort of political domination or some other kind of aim. Sociological definitions typically point to different kinds of material facts about a conflict, often for the purposes of specific sociological analyses. So they might, for example, define conflicts as involving a certain number of casualties, as one definition came across, as one definition does that I came across, which defined war as resulting in at least 1,000 battle deaths, as well as a number of other conditions. So the definition I'm going to defend is, I guess it fits most naturally into the sociological definition, although it does. One of my aims is to propose a definition that could also be used for the purposes of international law as well. So here's my proposed definition. A war exists when there are two or more organised groups. These groups are engaged in intense hostilities, and I'm just summarising here a slightly longer description of criterion 3. There's no party to the conflict or no third party who has the authority or ability to adjudicate between the conflicting parties, or punish them, or otherwise maintain effective control. So I'm going to go through these briefly one by one. So two or more organised armed groups. I won't spend a lot of time on this. The difference between my definition and that of the ILA is that I don't require that the groups have to be armed to count as potential belligerents in a war. What I mean by organised is having features such as this. Again, this is very similar to the ILA's definition of an organised group. Command structure, training, recruitment, communications, logistical capacity. I don't think wearing of uniforms is required here, and that actually follows international law on this claim as well. Intense hostilities. So there is a bit of debate about how to define intensity of fighting, and the ILA does discuss it in some detail in their definition. Like the ILA, I don't think we should define intensity in relation to numbers of battle deaths. I think that's going to be an arbitrary line that's not going to be very helpful in pinpointing what's distinctive about war. So when I'm talking about intensity, what I actually think is a useful framework is to think about the effect of a conflict on the ability of civilians to meet their basic needs and on the basic functioning of states and communities affected by the conflict. So there's not really a bright line here. It's not going to be the case that the threshold of intensity is the same in every arena of conflict, because of course how disruptive a conflict is going to depend on some pre-existing facts about the state in which the conflict occurs. How resilient it is, how strong infrastructure is, how much control it exerts over its territory. But my proposed definition here is just that meets a definition of intensity when it seriously undermines or disrupts civilians' ability to meet their basic needs. What I mean by hostilities is not just the infliction of physical violence. And of course, this is partly motivated by considering the possibility or looking at whether it's possible for unarmed conflicts to count as wars. I think it's actually better to think of hostilities again about inflicting substantial damage. But in my view, that damage does not have to be what we might think of as sort of physical violence or physical damage. There could be circumstances where undermining, you could do substantial damage to the ability of civilians to live their lives in a way that doesn't necessarily involve physical violence. So again, intentional infliction of substantial damage to the lives and welfare of civilians and to the functioning of states and communities. No adjudicating authority. This is important because we want to distinguish war as a category from other kinds of inter- and intrastate violence. Basically, I don't want it to be the case that we want to classify all criminal violence as war, even if it's very disruptive, because most criminal violence, for example, takes place within a state that has effective control or authority over those criminal actors. So we clearly, I'm not advocating a definition of war that would extend to kind of all kinds of violence, even when it's disruptive. It has to be the case that war is characterised by a loss of effective authority. And I think that's consistent also with the way in which war is used in international law. What's missing from my definition? I make no reference to political aims. So in my definition, a conflict does not have to be motivated by the desire for political control in order to count as a war. So this is actually, I think, the point that needs most offence. Because, of course, if that's correct, and just a side note, the ILA also doesn't make reference to political aims. So that's also kind of an interesting fact about the ILA's proposed definition. So one objection to my definition is that, well, it looks like, at least in theory, it's possible that certain kinds of extreme criminal violence could meet my definition of war. And if that's the case, then belligerent status would apply to a criminal organisation. And a lot of people find that very counterintuitive. One case study I consider, and I think this is, perhaps if we just take some facts for granted, the Mexican drug cartels. Certainly the conflict between the Mexican drug cartels and the Mexican government meets a condition of intense hostilities. I think the death tolls exceeded over 60,000 people in 10 years. There's certainly, I think, a good case to be made that there's been a breakdown of effective authority, that the Mexican government does not have effective control over large areas of its own country, which are controlled by the cartels. Certainly the drug cartels are organised groups. They actually have quite a sophisticated command structure, hierarchy and so forth. So it looks like, if I apply my definition, there would be a case to be made for saying that this could meet the definition of war. But of course that would mean that the drug cartels would have belligerent status, including the right to fight back against Mexican government soldiers. And for many people that seems like, well, that's very counterintuitive. Why would we want to give criminals the right to fight back? That just seems wrong. Now, there's two objections, I think, to this idea that I want to respond to quickly. First, the first objection to my proposal here is to say, look, first of all, it's just totally counterintuitive to say that criminals working for drug cartels could have the legal status of combatants and permission to kill enemy soldiers. There's no basis for saying that we can give drug cartel soldiers the benefit of the doubt regarding the morality of their cause in the way that we might think we can do in relation to ordinary soldiers fighting for governments. Often in the just war tradition, without getting into a debate about the moral equality of combatants, there is a view that, generally speaking, soldiers fighting for states can be excused for fighting for unjust causes for a variety of reasons, one of which is to do with perhaps loyalty or patriotism or ignorance or other various reasons. So clearly we might think drug cartel soldiers, they know they're fighting for a criminal cause. What possible basis could there be for saying that they should have these legal rights of belligerence? Now, of course, that has some force, but the problem is, if that's the reason for denying belligerent status to cartels, the same argument's going to apply to some cases of states as well. Certainly, soldiers fighting for genocidal regimes, I think also it's going to be difficult to give them the benefit of the doubt and say, well, they had no idea that they were involved in an illegal and immoral operation. So I think, if the reason for denying belligerent status is that cartel soldiers are fighting for a clearly unjust cause, that same reason is going to work as denying belligerent status to soldiers fighting for some states and in some wars as well. So I don't think that's going to do the job. In addition, some of the reasons for excusing ordinary soldiers for fighting, such as exposure to propaganda or conscription, they actually apply to cartel soldiers as well. Many cartel soldiers actually are forcibly conscripted by the cartels. Their families are threatened, they're kidnapped, they're forced to fight. Cartel soldiers often use child soldiers too. So if, the fact that a soldier is forced to fight is a reason to excuse ordinary soldiers, then it's a reason to excuse cartel soldiers as well. The second reason for objecting to my characterization here is that, well, maybe war should be defined as, involving the pursuit of political aim. So maybe my definition fails because it doesn't involve that. I think that's problematic for two reasons. One, I think it's actually difficult to draw a clear and non-arbitrary distinction between political and non-political aims, even in relation to state action. There are certainly state wars that seem to blur that distinction. So wars, for example, wars of plunder, wars to gain control of trade routes, wars motivated by economic greed. Then it's like a bit of a blurred distinction there, I think, between what we might think as purely political and non-political aims. And second, I just don't think it's necessary that war be defined as involving political aims. Now, having political aims certainly could be relevant and is relevant to deciding whether a war is just, but I don't think it's relevant to deciding whether a conflict is a war. And on that point, I actually follow Grotius. Grotius himself said that, look, there are public wars fought for political aims, and there are private wars, and they're all just part of the species war, right? They're not, having public aims or political aims is not definitive of war, it's just one kind of war. And so I would actually follow that view too. And I think, remember that if the point of the laws of armed conflict, or at least one of the points, is to restrain or try and control or mitigate the destruction caused by conflict, then really, it doesn't really matter why people are fighting. It matters that we actually try and control the conflict as much as we can. And if the laws of war have that purpose, then they ought to be applied to conflicts that meet the criterion of intense hostilities and lack of authority, even if the belligerents involved are not traditional states. Okay, so I'll leave it there, and Dr. Morkevicius will be next. Thank you.
So I don't know what it says about my character, but I wanted to fit in with everyone else, so I have a PowerPoint. So there we go. So I'm Valerie Morkevicius. I'm at Colgate University, and I spent a year here as a fellow, which has really been formative. So I want to say thank you to Ed and to the Center for that opportunity and for this one. So my contribution to this volume is a chapter that explores the idea of civilian immunity in soft war. And to do what I always tell my students they should do when they write papers in political science, I'm going to give you the conclusion to the plot before I give you the whole argument. So this is a lesser evil argument where I'm claiming that I would prefer to have my property directly targeted in a soft war attack than to have my person indirectly killed as collateral damage in a kinetic force attack. So if that's sort of the moral intuition I'm going with, I try to decide in the paper if we could make a just war claim for that kind of moral intuition. So hopefully I know which way to go. There we go. I'm a just war thinker, but I'm also a realist, maybe more of a realist than a just war thinker, depending on who you ask. But I think both as a realist and a just war thinker that war is inevitable, right? So whether it's because of human nature or because of the nature of geopolitics, there's really no way to get out of war in our current political system. I also think that war can be a corrective measure. So in just war terms, it's about accomplishing justice, preventing injustice, or undoing injustices that have happened in some point in the past. As a realist, it's about maintaining balance and order in the system, which is also a form of course correction. Furthermore, because I do have this moral intuition, unlike what some realists at least publicly claim, I think that just war should only respond to wrongs, right? So you can't have a just war that's fought for self-aggrandizement or for honor or something like that. And that just wars have to be limited, right? And we're going to focus on this aspect of just wars being limited. So what does it mean that a war should be limited if we're talking about soft war, which doesn't involve the use of kinetic force? Well, the first problem, as Michael was pointing out, is to try to define it. And in the chapter, I have to admit, I'm kind of disappointed with myself. I kicked the can down the road a little bit. So I say there's two possible ways of thinking about soft war. One is to think of it as a category of political action somewhere between peace and war, or what Walzer calls jus ad vim. And that might be things like coercive diplomacy, sanctions, and isolated cyber attacks. Or we could think of soft war as a kind of tactic of war, something that might happen during a larger conflict where kinetic force is being used, such as cyber warfare or information warfare that's party to another conflict. And I think that my way of thinking about soft war is applicable, my way of thinking about non-combatant immunity is applicable whichever one we're talking about. So I'm going to keep kicking the can down the road. I don't care if soft war is jus ad vim or just a tactic of war in a kinetic conflict. I also want to point out that I think a false dichotomy often comes up when we're thinking about soft war tactics. And this is particularly true in some of our conversations. We had an authors conference in Manchester that was really quite interesting. And some people were saying, well, soft war is coercive, right? And soft war is really just war by another name, right? This is war by another name, right, on the right. That's hard war. That's what happens when you don't do soft war, right? That's Warsaw, by the way. This is still Warsaw. Here, right, today, completely rebuilt in a Disneyland-like fashion. But that being said, right, I would prefer that we could keep these structures more or less in place, if that were possible, and accomplish our political aims using soft war tactics that leave the people and the buildings in place rather than that. So for me, it's not a choice between soft war and peace, right, but a choice between soft war and hard war, right, or hot war. Okay, so let's think about what's at stake here. So in terms of innocence and liability, this is the way that we normally begin our conversations about non-combatant immunity. And the first thing I want to do is disabuse you of the idea that innocence means moral innocence. It doesn't in the historical tradition, thinking of Augustine and Aquinas and Vittoria. Instead, it means non nocere, which in Latin means not harming. So someone who's innocent is someone who isn't harming you. They're not posing a threat to you. And the logic of not killing innocents in war within the canonical tradition hinges on the idea that force can only be used against those who are actively committing the wrong or who pose a lethal threat to you, right? But what about coercion? So we often have, especially in modern just war discourse, this sort of slide from, oh, right, we have non-combatant immunity and innocence, so they can't be targeted, right? But we go beyond targeted with lethal force to thinking sometimes about general targeting, right, for coercion. And I want to argue maybe it's okay to coerce civilians. And ironically, I think this is more applicable to democracies. So hopefully nobody's watching who might use it this way. Okay, so coercion may be permissible, but I think it has to be limited. It can't involve deadly harm or the threat thereof. So I think that it is immoral to threaten deadly harm as a way of coercing civilians because it puts them in a situation that's untenable. By the nature of being civilians or not posing a lethal harm, they have no way to undo a threat of lethal harm posed against them, right? Hence, I think it's unjust to pose even the threat of lethal harm. I also think that in terms of coercing civilians, we have to remember, as Augustine would say, the purpose of war is peace. And we have to be aiming at peace. So we don't want to coerce civilians because we're angry at them, because we want to retaliate against them because of what their governments did, because we want to humiliate them because we don't like what their governments do. Instead, we have to be thinking about coercing them for a specific end, and that end, right, is a lasting and durable peace between us and their state. And I think that last one actually leads to a lot of limitation in terms of what coercion might be permissible. So let's talk for a moment specifically about what non-combatant immunity means within the tradition. This is Vittoria, and I'm relying heavily on his definition today. So the tradition from Aquinas onward argued that killing innocents is always unlawful. And Vittoria said, well, unless there's evidence to the contrary or they're found actually fighting in the war, right? So clearly the problem of civilians taking up arms is not a modern 21st century problem. It's actually a 15th and 16th century problem that Vittoria was aware of. Vittoria also does something really interesting. The concept of double effect, we talk about it all the time today, and it seems very natural, but he's the one who put it together with the idea of killing in war. So for Aquinas, 300 years earlier, double effect was only about killing people in terms of defending your own personal life, right? So Aquinas said actually you could kill someone in personal self-defense, which was a radical change from people who had been working before him, because of this principle of double effect. I don't mean to kill you when I'm defending myself. It's a byproduct of my not wanting to die, which is a natural thing for any living organism to do. Vittoria says, well, let's think about the way war is fought, right? So we have a fortress, and we want to storm it, right? And so we're going to use all of our artillery power to attack that fortress. What do you think about the targeting capabilities of 15th and 16th century armaments? Can they specifically choose a particular tower on that wall that's shooting at them, or are they just going to aim in the general direction of the wall? So that's Vittoria's point, right? Is we can't take down the wall without risking hitting the people who are behind it, right? And probably we're going to end up burning the entire city. And if we can't do that, then we actually can't fight wars, because every city in Europe now has a wall. So he says, well, okay, I think the principle of double effect applies to civilian immunity too, which is if your purpose is to take down the wall, which is a legitimate military target, then if civilians are indirectly and therefore accidentally killed in the process, then that's one of the tragedies of war, but it is permissible for him. He also talks about other harms, and this is where Vittoria and I start to differ. So he says destruction of homes, farms, and seizure of personal property is completely okay, so long as the war cannot be satisfactorily waged without plundering the farmers. Right? So, if plundering them helps you wage the war, go ahead, and that's where I'm going to start to differ. But the point that I want to make here is that while he says you can't kill civilians directly, you can inflict a great deal of harm on their property directly. So let's think about that intuition coming from Vittoria for a moment. I think that any coercion of civilians by targeting their property has to be governed by three principles: necessity, order, and proportionality. So let's talk about each one incredibly briefly, since I'm already at 9 minutes and I'm trying to be faster today. So in terms of necessity, Vittoria, as I pointed out, said, well, we can't really do these things if there's other satisfactory ways of accomplishing our goals. And I think that would apply for soft war targets as well, right? So for one example, if we're thinking of perhaps taking over somebody's personal computer in order to use it for a bot attack, if there is a military computer we could get access to rather than using a personal civilian computer to do that, that would probably be better. But if the only way to do it is through a civilian computer, right, then that would meet the principle of necessity. Likewise, Walter says, in terms of defining necessity, that we have to think about whether there's some other way that we could do what we're trying to do without significant risk, right? And I think that applies here as well. The principle of order is one which you often don't think about in contemporary just war thinking, but which matters a lot to me as a sort of canonical thinker and as somebody who's really a realist at heart. And I think order functions in two ways to limit what we can do in terms of coercion. First, we can't do anything in terms of coercing civilians that would make accomplishing our postbellum aim of peace impossible. So things that would unnecessarily anger, hurt, infuriate the population would probably violate that principle. Secondly, I think we can't induce chaos. And by chaos, I mean total disorder constituting a human disaster and the breakdown of authority. So certain kinds of misinformation and disinformation might undermine order in ways that would be impermissible. Lastly, I think that in terms of coercing civilians, we have to always be bound by the principle of proportionality, which traditionally applies only to indirect harm, and in this case, I'm thinking also about direct harm as well. Okay, so last but not least, what would this look like in practice? And I have three categories of soft war events that I'd like to think about. So there's a set which are off limits, things which I think are probably never permissible. There's a set of things which are possibly permissible, right, depending on how necessity, order, and proportionality apply in your particular case. And then there's a set of soft war tactics that I think are likely permissible, that will often, right, meet that bar. So thinking about off-limits things first. First of all, right, I want to reiterate that I don't want to change the general underlying principle of non-combatant immunity. So deadly force used against civilians, right, even if you could use a soft war means to accomplish that, still impermissible, right? So thinking about some sorts of cyber attacks. The direct targeting of civilian property essential to life, therefore, must also be off limits. right? And some things with that are quite obvious, right? So I disagree with Vittoria. Vittoria said you could destroy farmers' fields because who eats the crops that they grow? Soldiers do, right? That doesn't work for me. Here I'm following Waltzer's understanding of dual use, which is that soldiers are both humans and soldiers, and things they need as humans are not destructible because all humans in that society need it, not only the soldiers. So food, the markets where food is traded, whether that be, right, your local Price Chopper or Wegmans or Jewel, or whether that be, right, a more traditional market, if we don't have markets, we have no way of moving food around the country. Housing, civilian housing is also necessary for life. Sanitation facilities, water facilities, necessary for life. And lastly, medical targets. And by this I mean not only hospitals, but if we think about a digital age in which more and more of our medical information is being compiled into databases, that information may in some cases be essential for doctors providing healthcare to particular patients. So targeting that medical information would be impermissible because it's essential to life. Likewise, if you had a way of hacking into all sorts of medical devices and switching them off simultaneously, right, that would violate this principle quite clearly. We've already talked a little bit about dual-use goods, right? Something in the chapter which might not normally be thought of as off-limits, but that I want to be off-limits in terms of direct targeting, are various digital archives. Right? Not only physical archives, but digital archives. So when I think about the principle of order, part of the idea of order is we're maintaining a society, right? And what do we value as a society? We keep the things we value in archives, whether that be music or cultural objects, right? Thinking about museums, literature, libraries. Just because those things may be moving online or even being created online in a digital era doesn't mean that targeting those things is acceptable. And I actually think they ought to be off limits for direct targeting in a software attack, because undermining people's ability to project their culture into the future undermines order in ways that would make postbellum reconciliation difficult, if not impossible. And lastly, I think there are some aspects of information warfare that are inherently impermissible. And when I talk about lying, I'm drawing here on both Augustine and Aquinas. So Augustine, quite interestingly, permitted ambushes and ruses, but forbade lying, right? So you can't lie to the enemy, you can't break your promises with the enemy. And in this case, Aquinas actually takes Augustine's principle and explains what's at stake in each, right? So in an ambush or a ruse, you're withholding information from the enemy, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? You're not lying, you're just keeping some things private to yourself, and strategically that's quite necessary. Whereas on the other hand, right, lying or breaking of promises is an active attempt to misinform or disinform the enemy. And I think in terms of information warfare aimed at civilians, it's one thing to prevent them from having access to information, so shutting down Twitter and Facebook and the government's media organizations and so forth is one thing, right? That's just denying information. It's quite another to feed misinformation and lies into the media, because those lies can't be taken away after the war, right? We can talk a little bit about what I have in mind here, but in the chapter I talk about the 2014 invasion of Crimea, and how the hacktivists, perhaps, I'm going to be generous, hacktivists put stories into the media that made it appear as if Ukrainian nationals of Russian descent, right, were being targeted for violence deliberately by Ukrainian nationals of Ukrainian descent. And that created this idea that there was an ethnic war going on, right? But you can't undo that after the conflict, and so it violates the principle of maintaining order, right? And so I think it should be off limits. There are a few things which I think are possibly permissible, which include targeted sanctions. So unlike sanctions that might target food and dual-use goods necessary for human sustenance, targeted sanctions aim simply at military targets. Also luxury targets are in the next one. State capacity matters here, however, right? So some states might not have the capacity to prevent the harms of a targeted sanction from falling onto their vulnerable populations. And I think we have to think about state capacity and also state willingness to protect civilians in terms of calculating proportionality, right? So whether a targeted sanction is proportional or not in terms of the harm it does to a civilian population depends on an intervening variable, and we ought to think about that in advance. And I think it's probably often going to be permissible to target non-essential dual-use items and infrastructures Then there's a whole bunch of things I think are likely permissible targets. So this includes sanctions on non-essential goods. And Tamar Meisels, who is one of the editors, I think sort of partly tongue-in-cheek, asked me, so you mean, right, denying teddy bears and chocolates, right, to dictators? And I said, yes, exactly, right? But if you can shut down a dictator's ability to move his money around, right, and you can shut down his Swiss bank accounts, right, or his wife's Swiss bank account, right? She's a civilian and has nothing to do with it. But I'm okay with that, and I think that it's likely permissible, even though you're using coercion of a civilian, right, in order to accomplish your military aim. It's a non-essential good, it's inconvenient, right, but it's not fatal. I think this also applies to limited cyber attacks on the media and banking. So let's talk about banking just for 1 second. I think it would be wrong to destroy everyone's banking information permanently, because our entire economic system would collapse, and that would obviously create the kind of chaos that I think is impermissible to create in a society. However, right, if you shut down my bank account for 48 hours, right, I will probably be able to survive. For a week, I'll have to start to barter with people for food, but we can probably get by. Much more than that, right, and especially in a society that's heavily dependent on bank cards, we might start getting into impermissible amounts of civilian harm, right? So there might be some possibility that you could use this as a way of targeting. Interestingly, I think this matters more in a modern industrialized democracy than it might elsewhere. And lastly, cyber attacks that merely pass through civilian devices, I think, are likely permissible. So here in the chapter, I draw parallels to conventional warfare. But if you can drive a tank down a civilian road when you're occupying a city, then you can probably send malicious code through a civilian's computer on the way to a computer that is a legitimate target, right? So this is in response to some of the critiques of Stuxnet, right, that it's moving around through lots of people's computers, many of which are not targetable. To me, if it's not harming your computer, it's just passing through, right, that's no different, right, than a tank rolling down your street. It might even cause less damage depending on how thick your asphalt is. So I think there are some things which might be permissible, some things which could be permissible, some things which are never permissible. But I do think that soft war should change and does change the way we think about civilian immunity. So with that, I'll hand it over to Mark.
It's the same presentation that I started with earlier. I'm going to follow up a little bit with some of the remarks that were made earlier. I think you're beginning to get an idea of some of the issues that we're trying to wrestle with here when we talk about soft war. Valerie raised a number of questions about what is permissible and what is impermissible. I want to follow through and ask the question, which kinds of tactics are effective and which kinds might not be effective, specifically those that are effective. Very often when we do just war theory or law of armed conflict, we stop with the permissible question and we never really ask ourselves, is this tactic or that tactic really effective? So the first thing I want to do is talk about some notion of effectiveness, because when we talk about effectiveness in terms of military tactics, we're usually weighing some sort of military advantage. When we talk about effectiveness in terms of the kinds of issues that were raised here, there's a whole range of outcomes against which we want to measure effectiveness. So some tactics are geared towards symbolic outcomes. Some are geared towards more intermediate outcomes, that is the acquisition or the ability to gain certain specific tactical goals. And some of the goals are measured against transformative or systemic effects, where you really want to use a particular tactic to achieve a transformative effect on the system. So I have 3 brief examples I want to throw up here. I want to mention symbolic goals, where the purpose is to disrupt social, educational, commercial events or projects. And one good example of that would be the boycott, divestiture, and sanction campaign that the Palestinians have been mounted as part of their own struggle against Israel over the past few years. And one thing I want to mention is that the examples I'm going to give here are taken in the context of asymmetric war, in the context of an ongoing conflict, and in a context where soft war tactics supplement kinetic warfare. So they're not divorced. This is part of an ongoing asymmetric conflict. where soft war tactics and hard war tactics are used together. Now, many of you may be familiar with this. This exercises the Israeli government to the extreme. And the effects are, in my opinion, significant, although they're symbolic effects. Israel is quick to point out very often that very little economic harm is caused, but very often that's not the point. The point is aimed, or these sorts of tactics are aimed at three audiences: the domestic audience, the compatriot audience of supporters, the adversarial audience, that would be the Israelis, and then also the world community. And each one reacts in a different way. From the compatriot point of view, these sorts of tactics increase a sense of empowerment, a sense of self-esteem and self-worth. They may be significantly used for mobilization, to allow the group to mobilize more quickly and better, to gain support within the group. Among the Israelis, I think they cause a certain amount of shame when a musician or a company withdraws from Israel, and within the international community, they raise a certain level of support and solidarity. But again, the focus is towards a symbolic outcome. In this case, they can be very successful. More tactical or limited goals would force compliance and force a specific policy change, and hunger strikes are a good example. Hunger strikes are emerging as a very important and very significant tactic in asymmetric warfare. It is a soft war tactic in the sense that it's non-kinetic. It does involve violence, specifically self-inflicted violence. It's been used by inmates at Guantanamo Bay. It's been used by the PKK in Turkey. It's been used by Israelis. In fact, now there's an ongoing hunger strike in Israel as we speak. The goals are very limited. None of these strikes are aiming for the Turks to grant the Kurds independence or the Israelis to leave the West Bank or America to depart Iran. Rather, the goals are very limited in the sense that the PKK went on strike for certain cultural goals, which included the use of the Kurdish language. The Israeli Palestinians went on strike in Israel for better prison conditions, and usually these strikes are successful. They play out over a period of 30 to 60 days, which is as long as you can usually go, depending on the kind of hunger strike you undertake. This is not the case in the United States. Of course, those of you who are familiar with what goes on at Guantanamo Bay, U.S. policy is to force feed within 72 hours, whereas in Turkey and in Israel, these play out over time. And usually, and in fact, in the cases that I threw up here, in the cases that I'm familiar with in those two countries, some compromise is always reached. Turks gain their right to use Kurdish in the courts and in schools. Palestinians gain various rights regarding administrative detention, prison conditions, visits, medical care, and so forth. So these can prove very, very effective as long as the goals are focused. And states are very often hamstrung when they try to deal with these. And since the goals are limited, and this game plays out as it does, compromise is usually the best solution for many states. But there's also some events that are transformative, that affect the conflict at a very systemic level. What you see here, some of you may remember this clip. This is a clip that was filmed in Gaza in 2001 by French TV of a Palestinian father and son who were caught in the crossfire between Israeli troops and Gaza. I have a full clip. If somebody wants it, you can see it. In the ensuing crossfire, it appears that the boy was killed. This became what's known as, I put it up here, as the Dura incident, and it's recognized today as one of the triggers of the Second Intifada. It was a media event, and it was a media clip that had it resonated tremendously among the Palestinians, among the world community, and among the Israelis. The reason I use it here is because several years later, the Israelis conducted their own investigation and said it was fraudulent, that it was staged. Now, I'm not going to take an issue on whether it was staged or not, but it provides the basis for an interesting thought experiment, and that is it permissible, and how do states react when non-state groups manipulate and fabricate the news or lie? This is what Valerie mentioned earlier. I take a more, I don't want to say charitable view, but I think it's a tactic that could be permissible under many circumstances, as long as it doesn't incite extreme violence, as this one later did. But there's many other instances as well. We saw the use of fabricated news in Lebanon in 2008 during the Lebanese war. Charlie Moore from CNN tells the story about after he was taken on a tour of battle sites by Hezbollah, and he was asked, well, what do you think? He said, well, this was just a dog and pony show. But it was a very good dog and pony show. And we've seen examples of that in Afghanistan. The Taliban has been known on more than one occasion to stage media events, to stage attacks, to take attacks that were directed against legitimate military targets and repackage them and advertise them and publicize them as attacks against civilians, manipulation, lying, as it were. These are extremely effective, and in some cases they can be transformative. So each of these types of soft war, or each of these goals, I could bring many other examples, but they play out at the symbolic, at the intermediate level, and at the transformative level, where they can have very interesting and very significant effects on the conflict. And then states ask themselves, well, what do we do? How do we manage the media war? What do we do when we face lying and fabricated information? How do we handle hunger strikes? How do we handle boycotts, whether they're symbolic or they're more extensive? How do we handle cyber attacks? And one of the answers I give, and I want to briefly mention it here, is to consider the idea of countermeasures. Some of you have seen this slide because I presented it at ISME, but one of the ways of looking at soft war in terms of cyber attacks, for example, the Tallinn Manual offers this example of a state B, which launches a cyber attack against the electrical generating facility at a dam in state A, is trying to coerce state A to increase the flow of water into a river running through states A and B. But the response is really interesting. The Tallinn Manual uses the idea of countermeasures to say that state A may lawfully respond with proportionate countermeasures, such as cyber operations against state B's irrigation control system. Now, what drives just war theorists, or at least some of us, to distraction is this violates dramatically the principle of distinction, because those who are being targeted in state B are farmers who have no skin in the game, at least at this point. They're not liable targets. They're not even military targets, but they're being targeted to balance the status quo. And one of the features of countermeasures in international law is not to achieve a military advantage, but to restore the legal status quo and force compliance with international law. They're considered what's called an international self-help measure. So one of the ways that we can look at soft war or legitimate responses to soft war is to adopt this kind of countermeasure paradigm, whether we're talking about information warfare, whether we're talking about economic warfare, whether we're talking about, well, hunger strikes don't quite work out, but there's a wide range of places where we can adopt the countermeasure paradigm instead of the more expansive paradigm in warfare that permits the use of kinetic force. So the difference is between these two paradigms is first over the question of distinction, and second over the question of proportionality. These kind of countermeasures, in contrast to the kinds of measures that we normally permit in kinetic warfare, permit the targeting of civilians. And this ties in very directly with what Valerie had to say. And in the exercise of soft war or unarmed force, we're going to see, and I think permit, the targeting of civilians under certain conditions, and I think Valerie laid these out insofar as the use of force is non-lethal, the effects are reversible, and there's some gain in terms of lesser evil or of benefits over costs. So each one is going to have to be weighed on a different measure. But also the proportionality criteria changes a little bit. Proportionality in countermeasures is proportionality as equivalence. It's purely tit for tat. You inflict X number of damage, very often quantified in terms of dollars. On us, we're going to inflict the same amount of harm quantified in dollars or some other coin on you. And this is very much different from proportionality in the law of armed conflict and proportionality in just war theory, because there we weigh, as all of you know, civilian casualties against expected military advantage. And we ask whether it's excessive or not, because the goal is something more than restoring the legal status quo. So when we see soft war, either standing alone or in the context of armed conflict, my own opinion is, and I think it may dovetail with some of my colleagues here, is we're going to push a little bit beyond we're going to use the basis of the countermeasure paradigm, but we're going to push a little bit farther. We're going to permit the direct targeting of civilians under the conditions I mentioned earlier. And I think we're going to push proportionality in the use of force a little bit more, because the goal is not restoring the legal status quo, but in fact gaining some military advantage in the context of an ongoing asymmetric, or in fact maybe not symmetric conflict that is usually going to be in the context of an armed conflict. So soft war has a very important point, but the rules governing the use of soft war are in many cases going to be very different than those governing the use of kinetic force. Thank you.
I think there are going to be plenty of questions, so let's just go to those. I'll refrain at this point. Randy.
Yeah, Dr. Wolfendale, removing political from the equation is an interesting move, but it seems to me that in all the cases we're interested in, war is essentially political, where we use it in a literal sense. Now, we may use it war on cancer, war between mafias and so forth, but that seems to me to be an extended sense. And as you probably know, Brian Oren's definition in the Stanford Encyclopedia, which is, as far as I know, the best philosophical definition that's attracted a lot of attention, does make it political. Now, I suspect what you're reacting to is that political sounds too much like between states, and we want to allow various non-state actors. But that can be done by making the organizations essentially political. They must have political ends. They may have political means too. And that would be much more in line with the way we normally use the word in the past hundreds of years, I think, rather than drop the political altogether. Now, you attempt to accommodate some of this by talking about the adjudication of this third party, the state that can control them. So presumably the mafias, at least in the U.S., if they're doing battle, there's the U.S. justice system that could or should take care of them. But this, your proposal has the odd effect of turning anything, any group violence in the state of nature into a war. Just magically turns it into a war. Whatever they're doing, whatever activities, whatever their motives. So I think we have to bring political back into the equation. Almost all philosophers I know do that. I think that's the essence of the term as it's been used, literally, in the last century. So I think it's a difficult and probably objectionable measure to pull political out of the equation.
Okay, so, I mean, as I said, there is a tradition of not including political in definitions of war, as we saw with Grotius's definition. So it's not that this idea is necessarily as radical as perhaps it sounds. I think it may well be true that when we use the word war, we do typically use it to refer to conflicts motivated by political aims. I don't believe that a definition of war has to match up perfectly, or even necessarily, capture necessarily, or match up perfectly with how it's been used in the last 100 years. My definition perfectly captures traditional concepts of war. All it does is say, look, what do we want? What do we want the laws of war to do? What is their purpose? Their purpose is, at least I think, has a kind of, in some ways, I share a realist goal, which is to provide conditions under which resolution of conflict is at least more possible than it would be under other kinds of legal frameworks governing violence. yeah, in an ideal world, sure, we would like to restrict perhaps the concept of war to political parties. Oh, and I should say too, I'm not actually motivated by the belief that it's traditionally between states. Of course, many non-state groups have explicitly political goals under any definition of political. That's fine. I don't see that as a problem. But if the purpose here, if what we're trying to do with the law of war is to allow the resolution of conflict, then if there's a conflict that meets all the other criteria of war, intensity of hostilities involving organised groups, the lack of any kind of authority who can exercise authority over the conflict, then it seems to me arbitrary to say, well, we won't call that a war because one side is not motivated by political aims. It seems there, well, the purpose of my definition, in a sense, is to allow us to say what makes these conflicts relevant to this category of international law, right? Now, of course, I think some of the disagreement might just be that we're talking about definitions that have different purposes. And certainly, as I said, if you're defining all for the purposes of normative analysis, then yeah, it might make total sense to talk about them in terms of politically motivated, because clearly you're not going to have a just war motivated by criminal aims. So, and I'm fine with that, but I'm not defending a normative definition, so that's not really a problem for me. I do feel quite strongly that, and one of the things I think that we have to face up today is that maybe it's going to be the case that there are non-political groups, whether they're state groups or they're non-political groups, that are able to inflict such damage that it might bring them into the framework that we traditionally restricted to thinking of only in terms of politically motivated groups. So I think in some ways my definition is traditionally we've thought about war in this way, although as I said there are deviations from that tradition in the tradition itself. So we've thought about like Grotius's suggestion. But the cartels are an interesting case because that is really an extraordinarily extreme example of criminal organisation gaining a huge amount of control over territories supposedly governed by the Mexican government. Now, if I'm wrong about the level of their control, that's fine, then it's not a war because it fails the other criteria of my definition. But if I'm right, then it's like, well, okay, it feels wrong, but actually this is the conditions which the law of war were designed to apply to in many ways, to try and help resolve these intractable conflicts. And also, that's not for nothing, if it's defined as a war, the Mexican government has expanded powers too, right? So it's on both sides. So I think we just have to, in some ways, agree to disagree about how essential political aims are to defining conflict as a war. So my purpose is defining conflict as a war for the purpose of thinking about, what the goals are of international law in this case, which I see as partly realist goals, versus other purposes we might have for defining war, so purposes for normative analysis or political analysis, in which case politics will play a much stronger role in the definition that we're using there. So I think that's the best I can do.
Thank you. Mitt.
Yeah, first of all, Jessica, I just want to mention, maybe you read Mary Calder's work, but she is someone I think you want to look at, because she argues much of what we think of as sort of armed conflict now is really criminal activity and conflict. But I wanted to ask Michael, and this sort of carries on a conversation we've had before. You talk about the potential risks with using a countermeasures framework for dealing with this, because you don't have the prohibition on distinction, or you don't have the principle of distinction, and proportionality may differ. I wonder whether we would be better off using the doctrine of reprisals, right? Which, in some quarters has been discredited. Some go so far as to say under customary international law it's prohibited, but I would argue there's not the clear sort of consensus about that. And a reprisal, I would think, would be governed by law of armed conflict, so that it would prohibit targeting civilians, but it also has a very strict sort of proportionality requirement that also, essentially sort of corresponds to the nature of the injury that you suffered. So I wonder whether relying on countermeasures actually would be less valuable than maybe resurrecting a doctrine that originally arose in a kinetic context, but that might be useful in this setting.
I think I require a little bit of clarification, because I understand countermeasures as non-kinetic reprisals. In other words, the same logic of reprisals whereby you're trying to, reprisals are a self-help measure,
Right.
whereby the proportionality is strict equivalence, and whereby the target is not necessarily a liable target in the just war sense.
Right.
So I think countermeasures are very close to the logic of reprisals, and in that sense are self-limiting. But are you suggesting the use of kinetic reprisals?
No, I'm saying that it's a doctrine that originated with respect to kinetic
Right, I agree.
activity, but incorporates law of armed conflict restrictions, particularly the principle of distinction.
Does it?
Yeah, yeah.
How so?
Oh, it does. Well, because you're engaged in the use of military force,
Right.
which triggers law of armed conflict restrictions. And you can't target civilians as in response to even an attack on your own civilians, for instance. I mean, so with the U.S. in the 1980s, the various attacks on American civilians by Libya, the U.S. targeted Libyan military objects. Right? And they presented this as a form of self-defense, which states sort of feel compelled to do in the post-charter era. But some have written that actually reprisals is a better way of thinking about these. And so you might be able to, it would require using something developed in a kinetic context into incorporating those principles into the non-kinetic setting. But you're right, it's a reprisal that's really the case. Yeah.
No, look, I think maybe we should talk about it further, because I've always understood reprisals, even armed reprisals, as formulated to target civilians. So Michael Walzer, for example, brings this example of how the French reprised against the Germans after the Germans killed some French partisans. They then killed German prisoners of war.
Belligerent reprisals during wartime.
Right.
Yeah, but in peacetime, you're not permitted to strike civilians.
Right, in peacetime.
Yeah.
Oh, well, then we get back to addressing this
Yeah,
question.
well, then we get back
Are we
to
in war or are we in peace?
Right.
Yeah.
But I tend to agree with you. There's a line there that we could follow and perhaps modify that would be appropriate, where we can incorporate some of the insights of reprisal. I think would be valuable also.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, so, yeah, just continue the discussion on the break. We'll take a break until 20 after, and I recommend buying this book when it's out. We've seen various chapters in our seminar.
Many
It's
copies.
excellent, and let's thank our speakers again.
Thank you.